I never thought at 72 I'd discover my own daughter's husband saw me as dead weight. I was folding Emily's laundry in their Austin home, my hip still aching from the surgery that landed me here 3 months ago, when I heard Jason's voice through the bedroom wall. "How much longer is your mother staying? She's becoming a real burden, Em. I can't even walk around in my own underwear anymore." The word burden hit me like a slap. 47 years as a school principal, raising 2 girls alone after their father died, and somehow I'd become the inconvenience. But what Jason didn't know was that his burden had been sitting on a small fortune for decades. Tech stocks my late husband bought in the 80s that were now worth millions. What would a struggling tech CEO do if that burden suddenly became his boss? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through Emily's kitchen window as I sat with my coffee, watching Austin wake up beyond the glass. 3 months I'd been here. 3 months since the hip replacement that had knocked me sideways at an age when I thought I was done with surprises. Emily's house was beautiful. One of those modern builds in the hills west of downtown where tech money had transformed old ranch land into subdivisions with names like Silicon Ridge and Innovation Heights. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter had insisted I stay with them during recovery. "Mom, you can't be alone right after surgery," she'd said, her nurse practitioner voice brooking no argument. Emily had always been the caretaker, even as a little girl patching up dolls and stray cats with the same gentle intensity she now brought to her hospital patients. It's what made her such a devoted wife to Jason, I suppose. Always accommodating, always smoothing rough edges, always putting other people's comfort before her own needs. But I wasn't a broken doll or a stray cat needing rescue. I was Lorraine Shepherd, former principal of Jefferson Elementary, where I'd managed budgets that would make most small business owners sweat. Disciplined, unruly teenagers who thought they could intimidate the gray-haired lady behind the desk, and somehow kept a school running on hope, determination, and whatever funding the state legislature decided we deserved that year. I'd done this for nearly 5 decades, through budget cuts and policy changes, through difficult parents and challenging students, through the constant pressure to do more with less, while maintaining standards that prepared children for an increasingly complex world. I'd raised 2 daughters as a single mother after Harold died when they were just 12 and 8, navigating the impossible balance of being both breadwinner and nurturer, disciplinarian and comforter. I'd sat through countless parent-teacher conferences, mediated disputes between millionaire tech executives and poverty-stricken families, always with the same steady hand and diplomatic voice that could diffuse tension while maintaining authority. Yet, here I sat, sipping coffee in my daughter's kitchen, feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own family, reduced to the role of recovering patient rather than the capable woman I'd been my entire adult life. Harold would have laughed at the situation, though not unkindly. My husband had been the quiet type, an accountant who worked for the state during the day, but had a peculiar hobby that consumed his evenings and weekends, investing in what he called the future. Back in the 80s and 90s, while I was busy raising girls and running a school, Harold would come home with stories about some new computer company or software startup he'd discovered. He'd sit at our kitchen table with financial newspapers spread before him, adjusting his glasses in that way he did when he was excited about numbers, studying stock charts and reading annual reports with the same intensity other men brought to sports statistics. "Mark my words, Laurie," he'd say, pointing to an article about some company I'd never heard of. "These technology companies are going to change everything. The way we work, the way we communicate, the way we live, and the people who recognize that early are going to benefit enormously. I'd smiled and nodded, more focused on whether the girls had finished their homework or if we had enough in the grocery budget for the week. Harold handled our finances with the same meticulous attention he brought to his state accounting job, and I trusted him completely. When Emily needed money for cheerleading uniforms or Sarah wanted to take art classes, Harold somehow found room in our modest budget. When the washing machine broke or the car needed repairs, he managed those expenses without making me worry about how we'd pay for them. When he died suddenly of a heart attack at 58, much too young, much too soon, I discovered he'd been buying stock certificates and storing them in an old leather portfolio in our bedroom closet. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, companies with names I recognized from the news but knew nothing about, beyond their existence. Companies that were just getting started when Harold bought in. Small investments that he'd made consistently over the years, while I was focused on the immediate needs of our family. I'd locked that portfolio away after Harold's funeral, and tried not to think about it. The life insurance had been enough to finish raising the girls comfortably, and my teacher's pension covered my modest needs. The stock certificates felt like Harold's secret hobby, something too complicated for a woman who'd spent her life focused on children and education rather than markets and money. I understood school budgets and educational policy, not corporate earnings and market volatility. That was 22 years ago. 22 years of compound growth, stock splits, and technological revolution that had transformed the small companies Harold had believed in into the giants that now dominated the global economy. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my reminiscing. Jason appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in one of his expensive button-downs, checking his phone with the focused intensity that seemed to consume him every waking moment. At 38, he carried himself with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, someone who'd never had to doubt his own relevance or value. He'd been charming when Emily first brought him home 7 years ago. Articulate, ambitious, full of plans for his artificial, intelligent startup and visions of changing the world through technology. That version of Jason had been genuinely interested in other people, asking thoughtful questions about my work at the school, listening to Emily's stories from the hospital with real attention, treating our family dinners as opportunities for connection rather than obligations to endure. But somewhere along the way, success and stress had hardened him into someone more distant, more dismissive, more focused on his own priorities than on the people around him. The charming young man who'd won Emily's heart had been replaced by someone who treated conversations like meetings to be efficiently concluded, and relationships like resources to be managed. "Morning, Mrs. Shepherd," he said without looking up. From his screen, his voice carrying the polite but perfunctory tone he might use with a hotel desk clerk or a service technician. "Good morning, Jason. Emily's already left for the hospital." "Yeah, early shift. Double coverage for some surgery. Thing." He poured coffee into a travel mug, still scrolling through what I assumed were work emails, his attention divided between our conversation and whatever digital urgency was competing for his focus. "I'll probably be late tonight. We're in the middle of some crucial negotiations." I nodded, watching him move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Everything about Jason was efficient. His morning routine, his carefully styled hair, his ability to make conversation without actually engaging, his talent for making other people feel like they were interrupting something more important. He treated our interactions like agenda items to be checked off, polite but perfunctory. Never quite rude enough to criticize, but never warm enough to feel genuine. "Is everything all right with the company?" I asked. genuine curiosity in my voice despite his obvious desire to conclude our exchange and move on with his day. He paused just for a moment, and I caught something in his expression. Worry, maybe, or frustration, a crack in the confident facade he maintained so carefully. But it passed quickly, replaced by his usual professional mask, the same expression I'd seen him wear during the few work calls I'd overheard. Everything's fine, just the usual startup challenges. Nothing I can't handle. His tone suggested the conversation was over, that he'd provided sufficient information to satisfy polite inquiry without revealing anything meaningful. I wanted to ask more, to understand what pressures were driving his increasing irritability and distance. But Jason was already heading toward the door, coffee in one hand, laptop bag in the other, his mind clearly focused on whatever challenges awaited him at the office. This was our typical morning interaction, brief, polite, and utterly impersonal. I was furniture to him. Useful furniture since I helped with household tasks and provided free childcare when needed, but furniture nonetheless. Present but not, really seen, functional but not valued. After he left, I found myself drawn to Emily's home office, a small room off the main living area where she kept her nursing journals and continuing education materials. The space was organized with the same careful attention Emily brought to everything else in her life. Medical textbooks arranged by subject, patient care protocols filed by date, continuing education certificates displayed in neat frames that spoke to her professional dedication. But what caught my attention wasn't her medical texts. It was the stack of Austin Business Journal magazines on her desk, several with headlines about the local tech scene. Emily had always been interested in Jason's work, even when he didn't encourage her involvement, and she subscribed to local business publications to better understand the industry that consumed so much of his time and energy. I flipped through the most recent issue, my eyes scanning articles about venture capital, startup valuations, and the ever-changing landscape of Austin's technology sector. The language was dense with jargon I didn't fully understand, but the underlying themes were familiar. Competition for resources, pressure to grow quickly, the constant challenge of balancing innovation with profitability. One article titled Austin AI Startups, Boom or Bust, featured a sidebar listing local companies and their recent funding rounds. There, halfway down the list, was Jason's company, Neuratech Solutions, founded 2018, AI-driven business intelligence, seeking Series B funding. The description was vague but professional, the kind of corporate language that revealed nothing while sounding impressive. But the funding notation caught my attention. Seeking suggested they hadn't secured it yet, that Jason's company was still looking for investors rather than celebrating recent success. I made a mental note to remember that detail, though I wasn't sure why it seemed important. Later that afternoon, I was arranging some of Harold's old books on Emily's shelf. She'd insisted I bring some personal items to make their house feel more like home. When I found it tucked between his accounting textbooks, the leather portfolio, I'd brought it with me without really thinking about it, the way you pack familiar objects when you're displaced from your normal routine, when you're trying to maintain some connection to your own life while living in someone else's space. The portfolio had been sitting in my temporary bedroom for months, unopened, like a time capsule from a life that felt increasingly distant. Now, sitting in Emily's living room with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, I opened it. For the first time in years, the stock certificates were still there, some yellowed with age, all signed in Harold's careful handwriting that I could have recognized anywhere. Apple Computer, purchased in 1987, when personal computers were still exotic luxury items, rather than household necessities. Microsoft Corporation, bought in 1989, when most people had never heard of Bill Gates or understood what software companies actually did. Amazon.com, acquired in 1997, when most people thought selling books online was a fool's errand, doomed to failure against established bookstore chains. Each certificate represented Harold's quiet faith in a future he wouldn't live to see, his belief that technology would transform the world in ways most people couldn't imagine. Looking at them now, with the benefit of decades of hindsight, I could see that Harold hadn't just been lucky. He'd been prescient, recognizing potential in companies that others dismissed or ignored. But it was the envelope tucked into the portfolio's back pocket that surprised me most. My name was written on it, in Harold's familiar script. For Laurie, when you're ready to see what we built together. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with more than just paper. Inside were 3 pages of Harold's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death, during what I now realized must have been a period when he was thinking seriously about mortality and legacy. "My dearest Laurie," the letter began, and I could hear his voice in every word, gentle but determined, the same tone he'd used when explaining something important to our daughters or walking me through some complex financial decision. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you finally looked at what I've been building for us all these years. I know you think of these investments as my hobby, my little obsession with technology companies, but they were never about the technology. They were never about proving how smart I was or how well I could pick winning stocks. They were about you. I watched you sacrifice opportunities for advancement so you could be home with the girls when they needed you. I saw you turn down the district supervisor position because it would have meant less time with our family, even though you were clearly the best candidate, and the promotion would have meant better pay and more influence. You poured yourself into being a mother and a teacher, giving everything to everyone else, and keeping nothing for yourself. Never complaining about what you were giving up, but never quite hiding the wistfulness in your eyes when you read about other people's career achievements. These stocks were my way of ensuring that someday, when the girls were grown and the world tried to tell you that your useful years were behind you, you'd have the means to prove them wrong. Not because you need to prove anything to anyone, but because you deserve the freedom to choose your own path, even if that path begins when most people think life is winding down. The woman I married was capable of running companies, not just classrooms. She was strategic enough to navigate school board politics and compassionate enough to see potential in every struggling student. She was strong enough to hold our family together when I couldn't be there anymore, smart enough to make complex decisions under pressure, and wise enough to inspire loyalty in people who didn't have to follow her, but chose to anyway. That woman doesn't disappear at 60 or 70 or 80. She just gets told she's invisible. Don't be invisible, Laurie. Take what we built and show the world what they've been overlooking. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision each time. Harold had seen it coming. This feeling of being sidelined, dismissed, treated as a burden rather than a person with value and potential. He'd spent 20 years quietly building me a foundation for independence I didn't even know I possessed, creating possibilities I'd never imagined for myself. My phone rang, startling me from Harold's letter. The caller ID showed Gabe Alvarez, and I smiled despite my emotional state. Gabe had been one of my young teachers back in the 90s, fresh out of college with more enthusiasm than experience. I'd mentored him through his first difficult years, watching him grow from an uncertain graduate into one of the most effective educators I'd ever supervised. We'd maintained our friendship even after he left education to become a financial advisor. Our bond strengthened by shared memories of late-night parent conferences and budget crisis meetings. Lori, how's the recovery going? Better than expected. Gabe, how's the family? Growing too fast and costing too much money. He laughed, the same warm chuckle I remembered from faculty meetings. Listen, I was thinking about you the other day. Have you ever done anything with Harold's old investments? Last time we talked, you mentioned he'd left some stock certificates. But that was years ago. I looked down at the leather portfolio, Harold's letter still in my trembling hand. The timing felt like more than coincidence. Actually, I was just looking at them. Gabe, can I ask you something? Hypothetically, what would investments from the 80s and 90s in companies like Apple and Microsoft be worth today? There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if he was calculating numbers or simply processing the implications of my question. Lori, please tell me you didn't throw those away or donate them to charity without checking. Their value first. No, I still have them. I just never knew what to do with them. They always felt like Harold's domain, not mine. Can you bring them to my office? Soon? Like, tomorrow soon? Something in his voice made me sit up straighter, an urgency that cut through his usual casual demeanor. Is everything all right? Everything's more than all right. Lori, if Harold was buying tech stocks in the 80s and held on to them through all the splits and growth, you might be sitting on a small fortune. A small fortune. The words echoed in my mind as I hung up. The phone, Harold's voice seeming to whisper from the pages of his letter. Don't be invisible, Lori. That evening, the fragile piece of our household routine shattered completely. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard Jason's voice from his home office, raised in frustration and carrying clearly through the thin walls. He was on a conference call, speaking to what sounded like potential investors, his professional composure cracking under obvious pressure. No, I understand your concerns about our burn rate, but you have to understand the market opportunity we're capturing. Here, he was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. AI-driven business intelligence is the future, and we're positioned to dominate that space if we can just secure the runway we need. I found myself moving closer to his office, not intentionally eavesdropping, but unable to avoid hearing his increasingly agitated responses to questions I couldn't hear. 3 months? That's not enough time to demonstrate the kind of market traction you're looking for. We need at least 6 months, preferably a year, to show you the growth trajectory that justifies your investment. There was a long pause, and I could imagine Jason listening to demands or ultimatums from the other end of the call. Look, I get it. You have other opportunities, other companies competing for your investment dollars. But if you walk away now, you're going to miss out on something revolutionary. This isn't just another software company. We're building the infrastructure for the next generation of business intelligence. I was reaching for my phone to call Emily and ask her to pick up groceries on her way home when I accidentally pressed the voice recording app instead of the contacts. Jason's voice continued to carry from his office, now being captured by my phone without my conscious intention. 60 days. Give me 60 days, and I'll have the numbers you need to make this decision. Our Q3 results are going to show the kind of growth that validates everything we've been telling you about our market position. Another pause. Longer this time. What do you mean, other management teams? My team built this technology from the ground up. We understand the market better than anyone else in this space because we created it. When he finally hung up, I heard him swear loudly, followed by the sound of papers being thrown, and what might have been his fist hitting the desk. Only then did I realize my phone was still recording, capturing not just his business conversation, but his private moment of frustration and fear. I stopped the recording and stared at my phone, unsure whether what I'd done was accidental surveillance or simply the unavoidable consequence of living in a house with thin walls and a son-in-law who didn't consider how his raised voice carried. Emily came home 20 minutes later, looking exhausted from her hospital shift. She immediately noticed the tension in the house. Jason's office door closed, the unusual silence where there should have been dinner conversation, my own distracted mood as I moved around the kitchen. "Everything okay?" she asked, dropping her purse and kicking off her shoes with the grateful sigh of someone who'd been on her feet for 12 hours. "Jason's having some work stress," I said carefully, not wanting to reveal how much I'd overheard, but needing to prepare her for his mood. "More than usual?" Before I could answer, Jason emerged from his office, his hair disheveled and his usually pristine appearance showing clear signs of strain. He barely acknowledged Emily's greeting, pouring himself a large glass of wine and drinking half of it in one swallow. "Rough day?" Emily asked, using the gentle tone she'd perfected for dealing with difficult patients and situations that required careful handling. "The investors are getting cold feet. They want to see unrealistic growth numbers in an impossible timeline, and they're making noise about bringing in outside management to optimize our operational efficiency." He made air quotes around the phrase, his disdain evident. "What does that mean?" Emily asked. "It means they think someone else could run my company better than I can." Jason's voice carried a bitterness I'd never heard before, revealing vulnerabilities he usually kept hidden behind his confident professional facade. "That's ridiculous," Emily said loyally. "You built this company from nothing." Apparently that's not enough anymore. Jason drained the rest of his wine and poured another glass. "They want to see market penetration numbers that would require us to basically give our software away, and they want to see it happen while maintaining profit margins that are mathematically impossible given our current cost structure." I found myself genuinely sympathetic to Jason's situation, understanding the impossible position of trying to satisfy investors who demanded contradictory results. But my sympathy evaporated with his next words. "And having to deal with family, complications on top of everything else isn't helping. I can't even decompress in my own house anymore." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Emily's face flushed with embarrassment, and I felt the familiar sting of being treated as an inconvenience rather than a person. "Jason," Emily said quietly, "Mom isn't— I'm not trying to be cruel, Em, but we both know this situation has gone on longer than anyone planned. I'm trying to save my company, and I need to be able to focus without worrying about household dynamics and family obligations." Family obligations. As if my presence in their home was some burden they were nobly shouldering rather than temporary assistance during a medical recovery. "Maybe I should start looking for my own place," I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the hurt and anger building inside me. "That's not what I meant," Jason said, but his relief was visible. "It's just that we're all under stress, and it might be better for everyone if we had more space." Emily looked between us, clearly torn between loyalty to her husband and protective instincts toward her mother. Her silence spoke volumes about the impossible position Jason had put her in. "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. That night I lay in bed listening to the recording on my phone, hearing Jason's desperation and fear beneath his professional language. His company was failing, his investors were losing confidence, and he was looking for someone to blame for his stress and frustration. I was a convenient target, present, dependent on his hospitality, unable to fight back without creating family. Conflict. But as I listened to Harold's letter one more time, I realized that Jason had made a fundamental miscalculation. I wasn't just a burden he had to tolerate. I was a woman with resources he didn't know about, intelligence he'd consistently underestimated, and a growing determination to prove that dismissing me had been his mistake, not mine. The next morning, I called Gabe before Emily and Jason were awake. "I want to meet today," I said without preamble. "I need to understand exactly what Harold left me, and I need to understand it quickly." "Lori, is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything's about to change, Gabe. The question is whether I'm going to be the one controlling that change, or just reacting to it." "Bring the portfolio," he said. "We'll figure out what you're working with, and then we'll talk about your options." As I hung up the phone, I could hear Jason moving around upstairs, preparing for another day of fighting, to save his company. He had no idea that his biggest problem wasn't investor confidence or market competition. His biggest problem was that he'd underestimated the wrong woman. The next morning, I called a taxi to take me to Gabe's office in downtown Austin. I hadn't driven since before the surgery, and the independence of moving through the city on my own felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was capable of navigating the world without depending on other people's schedules and preferences. Gabe's office was in one of the gleaming high-rises that had transformed Austin's skyline over the past decade, glass and steel monuments to the tech boom that had changed the city's character from quirky college town to major metropolitan center. As the elevator climbed to the 23rd floor, I watched the city spread out below me, a sprawling mix of old and new, tradition and innovation, not unlike myself. "Lori!" Gabe stood as I entered his office, the same warm smile I remembered from his teaching days. He was 44 now, his hair showing gray at the temples, but his eyes held the same enthusiasm that had made him such an engaging teacher. His office reflected his personality, professional but approachable, with family photos mixed among his business credentials and a few mementos from his education career. I placed Harold's portfolio on his desk with more ceremony than the moment. Probably warranted, but it felt significant, like I was finally taking the first step toward understanding what my husband had really left me. "I think it's time I understood what my husband left me," I said. Gabe opened the portfolio carefully, his expression growing more amazed with each certificate he examined. He pulled out a calculator and started making notes, occasionally letting out small whistles of appreciation that made my heart beat faster with anticipation and anxiety. "Lori, do you have any idea what you're looking at here?" "Harold's hobby." "Harold's genius, more like it." He held up the Apple certificate, studying it with the reverence some people reserved for historical artifacts. This Apple stock alone, he bought it at $12 a share in 1987. With all the splits since then, each original share has become 56 shares, at today's price of about $150 per share. He scribbled numbers on his notepad with increasing excitement. "That's over $8,000 for every share he originally bought." I felt dizzy, the number too large to process immediately. "How many shares did he buy?" "According to this certificate, 500 original shares." He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, amazement mixed with something like concern. "Lori, just the Apple stock is worth over $4 million. The number hung in the air between us like something too large to comprehend, too significant to be real. $4 million from one investment, one company that Harold had believed in when most people had never heard of personal computers. And there's more," Gabe continued, pulling out the Microsoft and Amazon certificates with the careful attention of someone handling priceless artifacts. A lot more. By the time he finished his calculations, the total portfolio value was north of $12 million. $12 million that had been sitting in a leather folder while I worried about grocery budgets and wondered if I was overstaying my welcome in my daughter's house. "What do I do with this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gabe leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression he used to get when working through a particularly challenging problem with his students. The look of someone trying to help another person see possibilities they couldn't yet imagine for themselves. "That depends. What do you want to do?" I thought about Harold's letter, about Emily's apologetic explanations of Jason's behavior, about the word burden, and how it had made me feel small and unwanted and invisible. I want to not be invisible anymore. Gabe smiled, the expression of a teacher who just heard a student articulate something important. "Then let's start by making these investments official. We'll transfer everything into your name, set up proper accounts, and then we'll talk about your options." As we worked through the paperwork over the next several hours, I found myself telling Gabe about my situation with Emily and Jason, about feeling like an unwanted guest in what was supposed to be my temporary home, about Jason's dismissive attitude, and Emily's painful position between her husband and her mother. "You know," Gabe said thoughtfully as we reviewed account statements, $12 million isn't just money. It's choices. It's the freedom to live on your own terms, to make decisions based on what you want, rather than what other people will allow. I keep thinking about something Harold wrote in the letter I found yesterday. He said the woman he married was capable of running companies, not just classrooms. Harold was right. I remember how you handled the district budget crisis back in Eeyore, 98. You were more strategic than most CEOs I work with now. You understood people systems and how to make complex organizations function under pressure. But I don't know anything about business. Real business, I mean. Lori, what do you think you were doing for 20 years? You managed budgets, personnel, strategic planning, crisis management, stakeholder relations, regulatory compliance. You negotiated with unions, dealt with government oversight, handled media relations during controversies. How is that different from running a company? I'd never thought about my education career in those terms, but as Gabe listed my responsibilities, I began to see parallels I'd never considered. Schools were complex organizations with multiple stakeholder groups, limited resources, and constant pressure to deliver results that could be measured and evaluated. The difference is that I understood education. I knew what we were trying to accomplish and how to measure success. So learn about business the same way you learned about education. Start with the basics. Surround yourself with people who know what you don't know, and apply the same strategic thinking that made you successful as a principal. I left Gabe's office that afternoon with a new portfolio, this one digital, held in investment accounts that would be managed professionally but controlled entirely by me. But more than that, I left with something I hadn't felt in months: possibility, the independence of having my own resources, my own options, my own power. To make choices about my life was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. For the first time since Harold's death, I wasn't dependent on other people's generosity or tolerance. I could live where I wanted, do what I wanted, and most importantly, I could command the respect that had been missing from my life. That evening, I was helping Emily with dinner when Jason came home in an even fouler mood than usual. His stress was becoming more visible daily, manifesting in shortened temper, distracted conversations, and an increasing tendency to treat everyone around him as obstacles to be managed rather than people deserving consideration. "How was your day, honey?" Emily asked, the same question she asked every evening, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she'd developed to avoid triggering his irritation. "Brutal. This funding round is turning into a nightmare." He loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of wine, drinking it with the desperate efficiency of someone medicating stress. "The investors are asking questions I can't answer, and our burn rate is higher than projected. If we don't secure additional funding in the next 60 days, we're looking at serious layoffs." I looked up from the vegetables I was chopping, genuinely curious despite my growing resentment of his treatment of me. "What kind of questions?" Jason glanced at me as if surprised I'd spoken, his expression suggesting he'd forgotten I was capable of understanding complex subjects. Technical stuff about our AI algorithms and market differentiation, competitive analysis, customer acquisition costs, lifetime value projections. Nothing it's pretty complex business strategy. There it was again, the assumption that I couldn't understand, couldn't contribute anything meaningful to a conversation about organizational challenges. The same dismissive attitude that reduced me to furniture in his mental landscape. "I ran budgets for a school district for 20 years, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the irritation building inside me. "I understand cash flow and strategic planning." Jason's expression was polite but dismissive, the look of someone humoring a child's attempt to join an adult conversation. "Sure, but this is different. It's venture capital, sophisticated investors, cutting-edge technology. The stakes are completely different." Emily shot him a warning look, but he either didn't notice or didn't care. "Of course," I said, returning to my vegetables with renewed focus. "I'm sure it's very complicated." But as I chopped carrots and listened to Jason complain about his funding challenges, I was thinking about $12 million, and Harold's belief that I was capable of more than anyone gave me credit for. I was thinking about the power to make choices instead of just accepting the choices other people made for me. After dinner, I excused myself to my room and spent the evening researching Jason's company with the same systematic approach I'd once used to evaluate school programs and education initiatives. What I found was illuminating and concerning in equal measure. Neurotech Solutions had been founded in 2018 with initial seed funding of $2 million, according to public filings I found through the Secretary of State's business registry. They'd raised another $3 million in Series A funding in 2020, but their burn rate was high. They were spending more than they earned, which was typical for tech startups, but unsustainable without continued investment. Their product was AI-driven, business intelligence software designed to help companies make sense of large data sets and identify market trends. It was legitimate technology with real applications, but the market was crowded with competitors, many with deeper pockets and more established client bases. What struck me most was how Jason's public persona as CEO differed dramatically from the stressed, irritable man I lived with. In interviews and press releases, he was confident, visionary, the kind of leader investors wanted to back. He spoke eloquently about market opportunities and technological innovation, presenting himself as someone who understood both the technical and business aspects of his industry. But at home, he was increasingly short-tempered and dismissive, especially toward me. I began to understand that Jason's treatment of me wasn't really about me at all. It was about his own insecurity, his fear that his company might fail, his need to feel powerful and in control in at least one area of his life. I was an easy target, an older woman, financially dependent on his hospitality, with no apparent resources or power to push back against his disrespect. The realization made me angry, but it also made me strategic. If Jason needed to feel powerful by diminishing others, what would happen if the power dynamic shifted completely? The next morning, I called my oldest friend, Harriet Hattie Bloom, and asked if she wanted to meet for lunch. Hattie had been my confidant since our children were small, a retired attorney with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. If anyone would understand what I was contemplating, it would be Hattie. We met at her favorite restaurant in South Austin, a family-owned Mexican place that had somehow survived the gentrification transforming the rest of the neighborhood. Hattie was already there when I arrived, holding court at a corner table with her trademark blend of whiskey and wisdom. "Laurie," she said, standing to embrace me. "You look different. Better. What's going on?" I told her everything. Harold's portfolio, the overheard conversation, Jason's increasing disrespect, my meeting with Gabe, and the staggering realization that I was worth $12 million. When I finished, Hattie sat back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. "Well, I'll be damned. Harold really did take care of you, didn't he? Better than I ever imagined. So what are you going to do with all that money? Buy a nice condo somewhere, travel the world, live like the wealthy widow you apparently are?" I was thinking about something more active. Hattie's eyes lit up with interest. Such as teaching my son-in-law about respect. How? I leaned across the table, lowering my voice even though the restaurant was loud enough to provide privacy. "What would you say if I told you I was thinking about buying his company?" Hattie's laugh was loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "I'd say it's about damn time someone reminded that boy that underestimating women is a dangerous habit. Is that approval?" "It's applause, honey. That son-in-law of yours has been asking for a reality check since the day Emily brought him home. The fact that you're in a position to provide it is just beautiful justice. But is it crazy? Am I letting hurt feelings drive me toward making a terrible decision?" Hattie considered the question seriously, her expression shifting from amusement to the thoughtful analysis that had made her such an effective attorney. "Laurie, you've been underestimated your entire life by colleagues who thought you were too nice to be an effective administrator, by school board members who thought they could push around the quiet principal, by family members who see you as someone to be managed rather than consulted. Harold saw what everyone else missed, and he gave you the tools to prove them wrong. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And you think buying Jason's company would prove them wrong? I think showing the world that a 72-year-old retired principal can successfully run a technology company would prove a lot of things wrong. That evening, I was in my room when I heard raised voices from the kitchen. Emily and Jason were having another argument, but this one was different. More heated, more direct than their usual careful disagreements. "I'm tired of apologizing for my mother's presence in our house," Emily was saying, her voice carrying a strength I hadn't heard in months. "I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to acknowledge that this situation has gone on longer than anyone planned. She's recovering from surgery, Jason. She's not here by choice. She's fine now. Her hip is healed. She's mobile. She could easily live on her own. But she's comfortable here, so she's staying. That's not fair. And you know it. What's not fair is that I can't decompress in my own house because we have a permanent house guest who monitors every conversation and judges every decision." I felt my face flush with anger. "Monitors every conversation, judges every decision. As if I were some kind of intrusive mother-in-law stereotype, rather than someone trying to stay out of their way while recovering from major surgery. She doesn't judge you, Jason. She barely speaks to you. Exactly. She sits there with that look, like she's evaluating everything I do and finding it wanting. The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. Jason's resentment toward me was deeper and more personal than I'd realized. He didn't just see me as an inconvenience. He saw me as a threat to his authority in his own home, a witness to his struggles and failures who made him feel exposed and vulnerable. But what Jason didn't understand was that I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was someone with the power to change the dynamic entirely, someone with resources he couldn't imagine and options he'd never considered. As I lay in bed that night, I made my decision. Jason wanted me to stop being invisible. He was about to get exactly what he'd asked for. The next few days fell into a deceptive routine. Emily worked her hospital shifts. Jason left early and came home late. And I maintained the household while secretly educating myself about business acquisitions and corporate finance. I spent hours in Emily's home office, using her laptop to research everything from hostile takeovers to due diligence procedures, teaching myself a vocabulary I'd never needed as a school principal. I called Gabe daily, ostensibly to check on the transfer of my investments, but really to pick his brain about how acquisitions worked, what due diligence looked like, and how someone might quietly acquire a controlling interest in a privately held company, without the current management knowing, until it was too late to stop it. You're asking very specific questions for someone who's just trying to understand her portfolio, he said during one of our conversations, his tone carrying the gentle suspicion of someone who knew me well enough to recognize when I was planning something. I'm curious about how the business world works. Is that suspicious? Only if you're planning something that might require my professional discretion as your financial advisor. I paused, considering how much to reveal. What would you say if I told you I was thinking about making an investment in a local tech company? I'd say that's an interesting diversification strategy. Which company? Neurotech Solutions. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Gabe? Lori, please tell me you're not thinking about investing in your son-in-law's company out of some misguided attempt to help your family. What if I told you I had other motivations? Another pause. Longer this time. Then I'd say we should meet in person to discuss this properly. We met the next afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Austin, away from both our usual environments. The space was crowded with young professionals working on laptops, the kind of place where conversations about business deals blended into the background noise of a city built on ambition and innovation. Gabe listened without interruption as I told him about Jason's behavior, about feeling invisible and dismissed, about Harold's letter and his belief that I was capable of more than anyone recognized. So, you want to buy his company to what exactly? Prove a point? I want to buy his company because I think I can run it better than he can. Gabe leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Amazement mixed with concern and what might have been admiration. Lori, do you have any idea what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that a woman who managed budgets, personnel, and strategic planning for decades might be capable of running a small tech company. I'm suggesting that someone who has been underestimated her entire life might surprise people. And you want to do this to a family member. I want to do this because family members should treat each other with respect. Jason sees me as a burden. I want him to see me as I really am. Gabe was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Okay, let's say this is feasible. What would you need to know? I pulled out a small notebook where I'd been jotting down questions. The same systematic approach I'd used to prepare for difficult school board meetings. First, how do I find out if they're really in financial trouble? Second, how does someone acquire a private company? Third, what would it take to do this quietly? Those are the right questions. He smiled, the expression of a teacher recognizing a well-prepared student. You really were wasted in education. I wasn't wasted. I was preparing. Over the next hour, Gabe explained the basics of corporate acquisition. We talked about due diligence, asset valuation, and the legal structures that would allow me to acquire Neurotech without Jason knowing who was behind the purchase until it was too late to stop it. The key, Gabe explained, is setting up shell companies and using intermediaries. You'd need lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing, but it's entirely legal as long as everything is disclosed properly to the SEC. How long would something like this take? If the company is really in financial distress, a few weeks, maybe a month. Desperate sellers move quickly. I thought about Jason's recent behavior, his increasing stress and irritability. And if I wanted to be generous in my offer, pay more than fair market value, then it would happen even faster. But Laurie, you need to understand, this isn't just about buying a company. You'd be responsible for employees, clients, legal obligations, ongoing operations. Are you prepared for that? The question haunted me as I drove home. Was I prepared to actually run a technology company? Was I driven by a desire for justice, or just revenge? And what would happen to Emily if my plan destroyed her marriage? That evening, I was in the kitchen when I overheard Jason on another phone call in his home office. This time, his voice was quieter but more desperate, the controlled panic of someone running out of options. I understand the timeline, but I'm telling you we need more time. The due diligence is taking longer than expected, and our Q3 numbers aren't going to be ready for another 2 weeks. There was a pause. Look, I get it. You have other opportunities, but if you walk away now, you're going to miss out on something revolutionary. The AI market is exploding, and we're positioned to capture a significant share if we can just get through this rough patch. Another pause. Longer this time. 60 days. Give me 60 days, and I'll have the numbers you need to make this decision. Our technology is solid, our team is dedicated, and our market opportunity is enormous. You just need to trust me on this. When he hung up, I heard him swear loudly, followed by the sound of papers being thrown. I found myself walking toward his office, motivated by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was concern, or maybe it was the beginning of a plan I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. I knocked gently on the doorframe. Jason looked up, his hair disheveled, his usually pristine appearance showing cracks. "Everything all right?" I asked. He stared at me for a moment, as if debating whether to maintain his usual dismissive facade, or acknowledge that I'd heard enough to know things weren't all right. "Just business stuff. Nothing I can't handle." Would it help to talk about it? Sometimes an outside perspective. No offense, Mrs. Shepherd, but this isn't the kind of problem that gets solved with a heart-to-heart conversation. There it was again. The assumption that I couldn't understand, couldn't contribute, couldn't be anything more than an aging woman who needed to be managed rather than consulted. "Of course not," I said quietly. "I hope things work out." As I turned to leave, Jason called after me. "Actually, Mrs. Shepherd, I've been meaning to ask, how much longer do you think you'll need to stay here? I mean, Your hip seems to be healing well, and I'm sure you're eager to get back to your own place." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Not, "How are you feeling?" or "What do you need to be comfortable?" but, "When are you leaving?" I hadn't really thought about a specific timeline. I said carefully, "It's just that Emily and I are thinking about making some changes to the house. Maybe converting the guest room into a home office. It would be easier to plan if we knew when. The space would be available." The message was clear. I was taking up space that could be used for something more important. I was, in his mind, a burden that had overstayed her welcome. "I'll talk to Emily about finding my own place soon," I said. "Great. I mean, no rush or anything. Just, planning ahead." That night I lay in bed thinking about the conversation, about the casual cruelty of treating a family member like a temporary inconvenience. But I also thought about the fear I'd heard in Jason's voice during his phone call, the desperation of someone watching his life's work slip away. The next morning I called Gabe before Emily and Jason were awake. "I want to move forward with the acquisition. Lori, are you sure about this? Once we start this process, I'm sure. Harold told me not to be invisible. I'm tired of being invisible." "Okay, give me a few days to set up the legal structure. In the meantime, I need you to think about what you want to accomplish. Is this revenge or is this business?" I thought about his question as I made coffee and watched Austin wake up through Emily's kitchen window. What did I want to accomplish? I wanted Jason to see me as I really was. Not a burden, not an inconvenience, not someone to be managed and dismissed, but a person with intelligence, resources, and value. I wanted Emily to see that women didn't have to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. I wanted to prove to myself that Harold had been right about my capabilities. But more than that, I wanted to do something meaningful with the resources Harold had left me. $12 million was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But Harold hadn't saved that money just so I could be comfortable. He'd saved it so I could be powerful. 3 days later, Gabe called with an update. "I've got your legal structure in place. 3 shell companies that trace back to you, but not obviously. I've also done some preliminary research on Neurotech's financial situation. And they're in worse shape than I thought. Their runway is maybe 3 months if they don't secure additional funding. They've already laid off about 30% of their staff, and their client retention is suffering because of service disruptions." I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for Jason, followed immediately by irritation at myself for the impulse. Jason's business problems didn't excuse his personal behavior, and his treatment of me had been consistently dismissive, regardless of his professional stress. What would it take to acquire them? Based on their last valuation and current circumstances, maybe $4 million. 5 if you want to be generous, and ensure a quick sale. $5 million. Less than half of what Harold had left me. Do it. "Lori, I need to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this?" I thought about Harold's letter, about feeling like unwelcome furniture in my daughter's house, about Jason's assumption that I couldn't understand complex problems. "I'm certain." "Then we'll start with an anonymous inquiry through intermediaries. I'll reach out to their legal counsel and express interest from a private investor. If they bite, we'll move to due diligence. How long? If they're as desperate as they seem, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I hung up the phone feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. That afternoon I was reading in the living room when Emily came home early from work. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her expression. Worry, maybe. or frustration. "You're home early," I observed. "Slow day at the hospital." She sat down heavily in the chair across from me. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you given any thought to what you want to do next? I mean, long term. Your hip is healing well, and I know being here isn't ideal for you." There was something careful in her tone, as if she was repeating a conversation she'd had with someone else. "Has Jason said something?" Emily's expression confirmed my suspicion. He's under a lot of stress with work, and he feels like we don't have privacy anymore. It's not personal, Mom. It's just that this house wasn't designed for 3 adults. I see." I closed my book and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. Emily was beautiful, intelligent, successful in her own right. But sitting there making excuses for her husband's impatience with her mother, she looked smaller than her 35 years. "Emily, can I ask you something? Do you think Jason respects you?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, does he treat you as an equal partner in your marriage? Or does he treat you as someone whose job is to keep his life comfortable?" "Mom, it's not that simple, isn't it?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her wrestling with something. "He's a good husband," she said finally. "That's not what I asked?" Emily stood up abruptly. "I should start dinner." But as she walked toward the kitchen, she paused and looked back at me. "Mom, do you think I'm weak?" The question broke my heart. "I think you're kind. I think you're generous. I think you've been taught to make yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger." "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "I think you're doing what women are taught to do. But kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's enabling." That evening, Jason came home in an even fouler mood than usual. He barely spoke during dinner, responded to Emily's attempts at conversation with grunts or single-word answers, and excused himself immediately afterward to take a work call. As Emily and I cleaned up the kitchen, I could hear him in his office, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "No, I understand the concern, but the technology is solid. We just need time to demonstrate market traction." "What do you mean, other opportunities?" "We had a deal." The call ended with what sounded like Jason slamming his phone down. Is he okay?" I asked Emily. She was scrubbing a pot with more force than necessary. "He'll be fine. He always figures things out." But I could see the worry in her shoulders, the way she was holding tension in her jaw. "Emily, what happens if his company fails?" She stopped scrubbing. "It won't fail." "But what if it does? Then we'll figure something out. That's what married people do." "And what about Jason? How does he handle failure?" Emily's hand stilled in the soapy water. "Why are you asking these questions?" "Because I care about you, and because I've seen how he treats people when he's stressed." She turned to face me, her expression defensive. "He's not treating anyone badly. He's just under pressure. He's treating me badly, and he's treating you badly." "Mom, please don't. When was the last time he asked about your day? When was the last time he thanked you for maintaining his household while he focused on work? When was the last time he treated you like a partner instead of a service provider?" Emily Czar, eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You don't understand our relationship. I understand that you deserve better." That night, I lay in bed thinking about my conversation with Emily. I'd pushed too hard, too fast. She wasn't ready to hear what I was trying to tell her, and my criticism of Jason had only made her defensive. But I'd seen the tears she was trying to hide. I'd heard the uncertainty in her voice when she said Jason would figure things out. Emily was beginning to see the cracks in her marriage, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. The next morning, Gabe called with news that made my pulse quicken. They bit. Neurotech's legal counsel reached out yesterday afternoon. They're interested in hearing more about our client's offer. That was fast. Desperation tends to speed things up. They want to meet next week to discuss terms. What's our next step? Due diligence. We'll need access to their financial records, client contracts, intellectual property documentation, everything that affects the company's value. And Jason won't know who's behind the inquiry. Not until we want him to. The beauty of shell companies and intermediary law firms is plausible deniability. I spent that weekend in a strange state of suspended animation, maintaining my normal routine, while late-eyed knowing that everything was about to change. I helped Emily with household tasks, made polite conversation with Jason, and tried not to think about what I was setting in motion. The acquisition documents were being prepared by lawyers I'd never met, using shell companies with names that meant nothing to anyone but me. In a matter of days, I would go from being a burden in my daughter's house to owning the company that consumed her husband's life. Harold's letter had been right about one thing. I was capable of more than anyone gave me credit for, including myself. The question was whether what I was capable of was justice or just revenge. On Sunday evening, I was in my room organizing some of Harold's personal effects when I found them, tucked behind the stock certificates in a section of the leather portfolio I hadn't noticed before. 3 more letters, each marked with dates spanning the final year of Harold's life, written in his careful handwriting, but with a tremor that spoke to his declining health. The first letter was dated 8 months before his death. My darling, Lori. I had another episode today. Not serious, the doctor says, but enough to remind me that time isn't infinite. I've been thinking about what happens to you when I'm gone. Not just financially, but emotionally. You've spent so much of your life taking care of other people that I worry you've forgotten how to put yourself first. These investments aren't just about money, love. They're about ensuring that when people try to make you feel small or invisible, and they will, because that's what this world does to women of a certain age, you'll have the power to prove them wrong, not because you need their approval, but because you deserve to live on your own terms. The second letter, dated 3 months before his death, was longer and more urgent. Lori, I need you to understand something important. The money I've set aside for you isn't meant to make your life easier. It's meant to make your life bigger. I've watched you accommodate everyone else's comfort for 30 years. You turned down promotions to be home with the girls. You took the smaller salary to stay at Jefferson Elementary instead of moving to the district office. You always chose family and community over personal advancement. I never told you this, but I was offered a job with a private accounting firm that would have doubled my salary. I turned it down because I saw how you sacrificed your career ambitions for our family, and I couldn't ask you to sacrifice anymore. Instead, I decided to build our future through investments, quietly and patiently, so that someday you could choose advancement instead of just accommodation. The woman I married was destined to run organizations, not just serve them. These stocks are your opportunity to prove that. The third letter was dated just weeks before his fatal heart attack. My dearest wife, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you've discovered not just what I left you, but why I left it. I have a confession. I knew this day would come, not just because of my health, but because I could see how the world was already trying to diminish you. At the last school board meeting I attended, I watched them dismiss your budget proposal without real consideration, simply because they had already decided what they thought of the elementary principles' ideas. I saw your face when they talked over you, when they acted as if your 20 years of educational leadership meant nothing compared to their business expertise. That night, I made the largest stock purchase of my life. Amazon. When everyone thought internet retail was a fad, I bought those shares with your face in mind, with the memory of how you looked when those men made you feel invisible. Don't let anyone make you invisible, Lori. Use what we built together to show them who they've been overlooking. I was still absorbing the full impact of Harold's words when my phone rang. Emily's number appeared on the screen, but her voice was wrong, shaky and frightened in a way that made my heart race. "Mom, I need you to come to the hospital. Now." "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "I'm in the emergency room. I collapsed during my shift. They think it might be." Her voice caught. "They think it might be my heart." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "I'm coming. Which hospital?" "St. David's downtown." "Mom, I'm scared." "I'll be right there, sweetheart. Have you called Jason?" There was a pause. I tried. It went to voicemail. I called a taxi and arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, finding Emily in an emergency room bed connected to monitors that beeped with reassuring regularity. She looked pale but stable, and seeing her sitting up talking to a nurse made my breathing return to normal. "What happened?" I asked, taking her hand. "Chest pains and shortness of breath during a surgery. The attending physician insisted I come down here immediately." She squeezed my fingers. "They've run some tests, but they want to keep me overnight for observation." "What do the doctors think it is?" "Stress, probably." My blood pressure was elevated and my EKG showed some irregularities, but nothing that suggests actual heart damage. Dr. Martinez thinks it's anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms. I thought about the tension in our house, the arguments between Emily and Jason, the stress of watching her husband's company fail, while feeling helpless to do anything about it. "Where's Jason?" I asked. Emily's expression darkened. "I've called him 4 times. The last time I reached him, he said he was in an important meeting and would try to get here when he could." "He said he'd try?" His exact words were, "Em, you know I'd be there if I could, but this investor meeting could save the company. The doctors say you're stable, right? I'll come as soon as I can break away." I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Emily was in the emergency room, potentially having a cardiac event, and Jason was prioritizing a business meeting. "That was 2 hours ago," Emily continued, tears starting to leak from the corners of her eyes. "Mom, what if something had been seriously wrong? What if I'd been having an actual heart attack?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make her feel worse, so I just held her hand and let her cry. At 9 o'clock, Jason finally appeared, still wearing his business suit and carrying the distracted energy of someone whose mind was elsewhere. He kissed Emily's forehead perfunctorily and immediately began asking questions about her condition, her prognosis, and when she could be discharged. "How long do they want to keep you?" he asked. "I've got that follow-up call with the investors, first thing tomorrow morning." Emily stared at her husband as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Jason, I thought I was having a heart attack. But you weren't, right? The doctors said it was just stress. Just stress." "You know what I mean. I'm glad you're okay, but this timing couldn't be worse. This deal could save the company." I watched my daughter's face as she absorbed her husband's priorities. Jason had revealed something fundamental about his character. When forced to choose between his wife's health and his business interests, He'd chosen business. "I think I'd like to rest now," Emily said quietly. Jason kissed her forehead again. "I'll pick you up tomorrow after your discharge, okay? Assuming everything goes well with the investor call." After he left, Emily and I sat in silence for a long time. "Mom," she said finally, "I think I understand what you were trying to tell me about respect." "Oh, sweetheart. He's not a bad person, but he's not a good partner." I stayed with Emily until she fell asleep, then took a taxi home to find Jason in his office, on yet another conference call about funding and investors and market opportunities. The contrast between his urgent attention to business matters and his casual dismissal of his wife's health crisis crystallized something for me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice in some abstract sense. It was about Emily, and about the kind of man her husband had revealed himself to be when faced with a real crisis. The next morning, Gabe called with an update that felt like destiny. "The diligence is complete, and they've accepted our offer. $5 million, cash deal, closing scheduled for next Friday." "That's fast. They're more desperate than we thought. But Lori, I need to warn you about something. Once we close this deal, there's no going back. You'll own Jason's company, and he'll know you were behind the acquisition. Are you prepared for the consequences?" I thought about Emily in the hospital bed, about Jason prioritizing investor calls over his wife's health, about Harold's letters and his belief that I shouldn't let anyone make me invisible. Gabe, what if this isn't about revenge at all? What if it's about showing my daughter that she deserves better than someone who treats her like a convenience, rather than a partner? Then you're not just buying a company. You're staging an intervention. Is that a bad thing? It's a dangerous thing. Family interventions can backfire spectacularly. So can letting people treat the ones you love badly, without consequences. That evening, Emily came home from the hospital with strict instructions to reduce stress and take better care of herself. Jason was solicitous and attentive, bringing her tea and adjusting pillows, but I could see Emily evaluating his behavior with new eyes. "How did the investor meeting go?" she asked. "Really well, actually. We might have found our white knight, a private investor willing to put in enough money to stabilize operations and fund growth." "That's wonderful," Emily said. But her tone was flat. "Yeah, the timing couldn't be better. Another week or two of uncertainty, and we might have been looking at bankruptcy." Emily nodded, but I could see her thinking about timing. How his wonderful business breakthrough had been more important than her medical emergency. That night, I reread Harold's letters one more time, focusing on his final words about not letting anyone make me invisible. But now I understood that the invisibility he'd warned against wasn't just about me. It was about all the women who got dismissed, accommodated, and taken for granted by men who'd never learned to see them clearly. In 4 days, I would own Jason's company. In 4 days, he would discover that the burden he'd been so eager to remove from his house had become his boss. But more than that, Emily would see that women didn't have to accept being treated as secondary priorities in their own lives. Harold had been right about me being capable of running companies, but he'd been even more right about something else. Sometimes the only way to stop being invisible was to become impossible to ignore. The week before the closing moved with dreamlike intensity, each day bringing me closer to a moment that would fundamentally alter not just my life, but the entire dynamic of my family. Gabe and his team of lawyers worked around the clock to finalize the acquisition documents, while I maintained the careful facade of a recovering mother-in-law who spent her days reading novels and helping with household tasks. Emily returned to work on light duty, Doctor's orders to avoid stress while her body recovered from what had been officially diagnosed as anxiety-induced cardiac symptoms. She moved through the house with a new awareness, watching Jason's behavior with the analytical attention of someone who had finally recognized patterns she'd been trained to ignore. Jason, meanwhile, was almost giddy with relief about his company's imminent salvation. The mysterious investor had agreed to all his terms, asked for minimal oversight, and promised quick closure. He strutted around the house with renewed confidence, his stress levels visibly decreased now that financial disaster had been averted. "You know what the best part is?" he told Emily over dinner on Wednesday night. "The investor wants to be completely hands-off. No board seats, no operational input, just silent money. It's exactly what we needed. Capital without interference." Nearly choked on my water. Silent money. If only he knew. "That seems unusual," Emily said, echoing my own thoughts. "Most investors want some level of control. Sometimes private investors are just looking for good returns, without the hassle of day-to-day management. It happens more often than you'd think with smaller deals." Jason's tone carried the confidence of someone who believed he'd outmaneuvered the system. "The best part is that I'll maintain full operational control while having the financial stability to really grow the company. On Thursday morning, I received a call that surprised me. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice belonged to someone from Jason's company. "Mrs. Shepard, this is Kelsey Martin from Neurotech Solutions. I got your number from the emergency contact list. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly." "Of course not. Is everything all right?" "Actually, I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. I have something I'd like to discuss with you, and it's complicated. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a small cafe near the university." Kelsey was younger than I'd expected, probably in her late 20s, with the earnest intensity of someone who took her work seriously. She arrived carrying a leather portfolio that looked remarkably similar to Harold's, though considerably newer. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as we settled into a corner booth. I wasn't sure if this was appropriate, but I didn't know who else to talk to. "What's on your mind?" Kelsey opened her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a formal resignation letter addressed to Jason, dated for the following Monday. "I've been with Neurotech since almost the beginning," she said. "I believed in the technology. I believed in the mission, and I thought I believed in Jason as a leader. But over the past year, I've watched him make decisions that prioritize his own interests over the company's welfare and the employees' well-being." She explained how Jason had laid off experienced developers while maintaining high executive salaries, how he'd promised clients features the company couldn't deliver, how he'd consistently dismissed suggestions from female employees while implementing identical ideas when they came from male colleagues. "The final straw was last week," she continued. "We had a client emergency, a data breach that required immediate attention. Jason was in investor meetings all day, so I handled the crisis response. We contained the breach, communicated with affected clients, and implemented additional security measures. It was exactly the kind of leadership moment that should have been recognized. And was it?" Jason took credit for the response in his investor presentation, never mentioning my role or the team that actually did the work. When I tried to discuss it with him privately, he told me I was being too sensitive, and that executive leadership means taking responsibility for everything that happens under your watch, good and bad. I recognized the pattern, the same dismissive attitude Jason had shown toward me, the same assumption that other people's contributions were somehow less valuable than his own. "So you're resigning?" I was going to. She folded the resignation letter carefully. But then I heard about the acquisition, and I started wondering if change might be possible after all. What kind of change? Kelsey leaned forward, her expression intense. Mrs. Shepherd, I know this might sound presumptuous, but I've done some research on your background. You ran Jefferson Elementary for 20 years, managed complex budgets, led diverse teams, handled crisis situations. Your leadership style was collaborative, strategic, focused on developing people rather than just managing them. I was surprised. She'd researched me at all. How do you know about my work? My cousin went to Jefferson. She still talks about how you changed the school culture, how you made everyone feel valued and heard. When I heard you were staying with the Miller family, I started wondering if there might be a connection to the acquisition. The implication hung in the air between us. Kelsey suspected I was involved in the purchase of Neurotech, and she was hoping it was true. What would you want from new ownership? I asked carefully, neither confirming nor denying her suspicion. Accountability, respect for employees, decision-making based on data and ethics rather than ego, the chance to build something sustainable instead of just chasing short-term profits. She opened the portfolio again and pulled out a comprehensive business plan, clearly prepared over many hours of careful analysis. I've been working on this for months. Strategies for sustainable growth, employee retention, client satisfaction, operational efficiency. Everything Jason has been too busy chasing investors to focus on. I studied her proposals, impressed by their thoroughness and practical applicability. Kelsey understood both the technical and business aspects of the company in ways that Jason seemed to have lost sight of. This is excellent work, I said honestly. I'm willing to resign if the new ownership doesn't want existing management involved. But I'm also willing to stay and help implement real changes if there's genuine commitment to doing things differently. We talked for another hour about her vision for the company, her analysis of current problems, and her ideas for solutions. By the time we parted, I understood that Kelsey represented something Jason had failed to recognize. The kind of dedicated, intelligent employee who could make any company successful if given the opportunity and respect she deserved. That evening, I found Emily in the kitchen staring at her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. Everything all right, sweetheart? She looked up, her eyes carrying a sadness that made my chest tighten. I've been thinking about what happened at the hospital, about Jason's priorities. And I've been reading about marriage counseling, about what healthy partnerships actually look like. She set down her phone and looked at me directly. Mom, I don't think I've been in a healthy partnership. I think I've been in a service contract. The words hung between us, honest and painful. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, but I know I can't keep pretending that being treated as a secondary priority is normal or acceptable. We were interrupted by Jason's arrival, his mood buoyant as he entered the kitchen with the energy of someone anticipating victory. Ladies, tomorrow's the big day. The acquisition closes at 10 a.m. and by lunchtime, Neurotech will be financially stable for the first time in months. Congratulations, Emily said, her tone carefully neutral. You know what this means? Jason continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. We can finally make some changes around here. Maybe take that vacation we've been talking about. Maybe look at a bigger house. He poured himself a glass of wine and turned to me with an expression that might have been intended as magnanimous. And Mrs. Shepherd, this probably means you can start making plans to get back to your own place. I know you've been wanting your independence back, and with the company stable, we'll have more time to help you find something suitable. There it was again. The assumption that I was eager to leave, that my presence was a burden everyone was politely tolerating, rather than a family member recovering from surgery. But this time, something in my expression must have given him pause. I mean, no rush or anything, he added quickly. Just that you probably want to get back to your normal routine. Actually, Jason, I said, my voice steady and clear, I think my normal routine is about to change significantly. What do you mean? I mean that tomorrow is going to be full of surprises for everyone. Jason laughed, the sound carrying his usual, dismissive confidence. What kind of surprises could you possibly have, Mrs. Shepherd? Emily looked between us, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify, the kind that remind people not to underestimate women of a certain age. I said quietly. That night, I called Gabe one final time before the closing. Are you ready for this? He asked. I've been ready for this my entire life. I just didn't know it until now. Any last-minute doubts? I thought about Harold's letters, about Emily's realization that she deserved better, about Kelsey's resignation letter and her willingness to sacrifice her job for her principles. No doubts, just determination. Then tomorrow, you become a business owner. Tomorrow, I said, I stop being invisible. As I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The calm confidence that comes from knowing you're about to do exactly what you were meant to do. Harold had seen this moment coming 20 years ago. He'd prepared me for it with patience and love, building the foundation for a transformation that would honor both his memory and my own capabilities. Tomorrow, Jason would discover that the burden he'd been so eager to remove from his house had become the person who controlled his professional future. Tomorrow, Emily would see that women didn't have to accept being treated as afterthoughts in their own lives. Tomorrow, I would prove that being underestimated wasn't a limitation. It was a strategic advantage. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Austin weather for late October. I dressed carefully. Not the casual clothes I'd been wearing around Emily's house, but the navy blue suit I'd worn to school board meetings, paired with pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't seen in months. Lorraine Shepherd, not as someone's mother or someone's temporary houseguest, but as herself. Gabe picked me up at 9:30, his expression mixing excitement with concern. Ready for this? As ready as anyone can be for completely changing their life. You know there's no going back after today. I wouldn't want to go back, even if I could. The law office was in one of Austin's newer high-rises, all glass and steel, with a view of the Colorado River that spoke to the kind of success Jason aspired to, but had never quite achieved. We were shown to a conference room on the 20th floor, where several people were already waiting. 2 lawyers representing Neuratech, another lawyer representing the shell company that was ostensibly buying them, and Jason. He looked different than he did at home. More polished, more confident, wearing what I recognized as his best suit. He shook hands with our lawyer and made small talk about the beautiful morning, seemingly unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. His energy was that of someone anticipating victory, relief, and vindication. The buyer should be here any minute, our lawyer said, checking his watch. Jason nodded enthusiastically. I'm looking forward to meeting them. It's not often you find an investor who's willing to be completely hands-off while providing the capital we need to really scale our operations. I caught the irony of his words. Hands-off was the last thing I intended to be. At exactly 10 o'clock, our lawyer stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the principal of Shepherd Holdings, LLC, the entity that's acquiring Neurotech Solutions. He gestured toward me, and I stood up slowly, watching Jason's face as recognition dawned like a slow-motion car accident. Mrs. Shepherd? Jason's voice was barely above a whisper, his confident expression cracking like ice in spring. Hello, Jason. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Jason's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic as his mind processed the impossible reality sitting across from him. I don't understand, he said finally, his voice hollow. I'm your new business partner, I said calmly, my voice carrying the same steady authority I'd used in difficult school board meetings. Or rather, I'm your new boss. Our lawyer began explaining the structure of the acquisition, the terms of the sale, and the legal transfer of ownership. The language was dense with corporate terminology, but the essential meaning was simple. As of this moment, I owned 100% of Neurotech Solutions. Jason's company, his life's work, his source of identity and income, now belonged to me. How? Jason asked when the lawyer paused, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Harold left me well provided for, I said simply. But you're 72 years old, a retired school principal, a burden. Jason's face went pale as the word hung in the air between us. He knew I'd heard him, had always known. But this was the first time it had been acknowledged directly. Mrs. Shepherd, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything, Jason. You need to sign the papers. The rest of the closing proceeded in a surreal haze. Documents were signed with mechanical precision. Ownership was transferred with legal finality, and I became the sole proprietor of Neurotech Solutions. Jason signed everything like someone in shock, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the stunned compliance of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. When the legal formalities were complete, our lawyer shook my hand with professional satisfaction. Congratulations, Ms. Shepherd. You're now the owner of a technology company. Jason hadn't moved from his seat. He was staring at the signed documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. Jason, I said gently, but with unmistakable authority. He looked up, his eyes carrying a vulnerability I'd never seen before. We need to talk about what happens next. He nodded mutely, the fight completely gone out of him. First, I want you to know that I have no intention of destroying your company or ruining your career. You built something worthwhile here, even if you haven't managed it as well as you could have. What do you want? His voice was hoarse. I want you to continue running day-to-day operations, at least for now. But you're going to report to me, and we're going to make some changes. What kind of changes? I pulled out a folder that Gabe had prepared for me, containing the analysis we'd done of the company's operations and inefficiencies. We're going to cut executive salaries by 20% and use that money to restore the positions you eliminated last month. We're going to move to a smaller, more efficient office space, and we're going to focus our marketing budget on measurable results instead of brand awareness campaigns that don't generate actual business. Jason was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said with the careful attention of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding new realities. Those are actually good ideas, he admitted reluctantly. I ran a school district for 20 years, Jason. I know how to manage budgets and personnel. But you don't know anything about technology. You're right. That's why I need you to teach me. And that's why you're going to keep running the technical side of the business assuming you can learn to do it with respect for the people who work for you. I don't understand. If you wanted to help the company, why didn't you just offer to invest? Why buy us out completely? I looked at him across the conference table, this man who had dismissed me as a burden, who had made me feel invisible in my daughter's home, who had prioritized investor meetings over his wife's medical emergency. Because respect isn't given, Jason. It's earned. And sometimes it has to be demanded. Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys. The physical keys to the Neurotech office. The symbol of ownership and authority he'd carried since founding the company. He set them on the table between us with the ceremony of someone surrendering a crown. "These are yours now," he said quietly. I picked up the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. They were heavier than I'd expected, not just with metal, but with the responsibility they represented. "We'll schedule a meeting for Monday morning at the Neurotech offices," I said. "You'll introduce me to the staff as the new owner and we'll begin the process of restructuring the company. The employees are going to have questions. I'm sure they will, and I'm sure you'll help me answer them honestly and professionally." What about Emily? What about our family? For the first time since the reveal, Jason's voice carried genuine emotion rather than just shock. "And calculation. That depends entirely on you, Jason. Emily deserves a husband who treats her as a partner, not a convenience. She deserves someone who prioritizes her well-being over business opportunities. Whether you can be that person remains to be seen. And if I can't, then you'll find yourself looking for both a new job and a new living situation." The weight of that statement settled over him like a physical presence. "What do I need to do?" he asked quietly. "You need to understand that respect isn't about age or gender or family relationships. It's about recognizing that other people have value, intelligence, and contributions to make, even if those contributions are different from your own." "I can do that. And you need to understand that Emily is your partner, not your support staff. Her feelings matter, her opinions have value, and her needs are as important as yours." Jason looked at his hands, then back at me. "Emily's lucky to have you as her mother. Emily's unlucky to have a husband who needed her mother to buy his company before he learned to treat her with respect." As we prepared to leave the law office, Jason called after me. "Mrs. Shepherd?" I turned back. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not destroying me. You could have, but you didn't. Jason, I don't want to destroy you. I want to help you become someone worth respecting. What if I can't change? What if this doesn't work?" I thought about Harold's letters, about Emily's realization that she deserved better, about Kelsey's willingness to resign rather than accept disrespectful treatment. Then you'll have learned an expensive lesson about the consequences of underestimating people. As I walked out of that conference room, the keys to Neurotech heavy in my purse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the intoxicating combination of power and purpose. I wasn't just the owner of a technology company. I was living proof that being dismissed and underestimated wasn't a limitation. It was preparation. For a moment when you could prove everyone wrong. Harold had been right about me being capable of running companies instead of just classrooms, but he'd been even more right about something else. Sometimes the only way to stop being invisible was to become impossible to ignore. Jason Miller had spent months treating me like a burden he had to tolerate. Now he would spend however long. He remained employed learning to see me as I really was, a woman who had turned his dismissal into his downfall, and his downfall into his education. 6 months later, I sat in my corner office at Neurotech's new downtown location, reviewing quarterly reports that exceeded every projection we'd made. The company Harold's investments had bought was thriving under collaborative leadership, efficient operations, and a culture that actually valued the intelligence of its employees. Kelsey Martin knocked on my open door, carrying the coffee she brought me every morning. A ritual that had evolved from professional courtesy into genuine friendship. "The client presentation went perfectly," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "They're ready to sign a 3-year contract." And the team, proud of their work and confident in their presentations. Funny how that happens when people feel valued. Kelsey had become my operational partner, the bridge between my management experience and the technical expertise the company required. Her resignation letter had never been submitted. Instead, she'd been promoted to Vice President of Operations with a salary that reflected her actual contributions rather than Jason's previous dismissive evaluation of her worth. "How's Jason adjusting to the new reporting structure?" I asked. "Better than expected. He's actually started asking for input instead of just giving orders. Yesterday, he credited Sarah Chen's algorithm improvements in the client meeting instead of taking credit himself." Jason had surprised everyone, including himself, by proving capable of growth when accountability was paired with opportunity rather than threatened with punishment. He remained CEO, handling client relationships and technical development, but he reported to me and operated within frameworks designed to prevent the ego-driven mistakes that had nearly destroyed the company. And the new hires? Settling in. Well, having those additional developers back makes everyone's job easier. We'd restored every position that had been eliminated during the financial crisis, plus added new roles focused on employee development and client satisfaction. The 20% reduction in executive salaries had funded not just jobs, but a culture shift that made Neurotech a place people wanted to work, rather than somewhere they felt lucky to survive. My phone rang. Emily calling during her lunch break, a daily ritual that had replaced our careful conversations around Jason's moods. "How's my CEO mother today?" she asked, warmth replacing the strain that had characterized her voice for months. "Tired but satisfied. How's marriage counseling going?" "Hard work, but good work. Jason's learning to see me as a partner instead of a support system, and I'm learning to speak up instead of just accommodating." Emily and Jason were rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than traditional roles. It wasn't easy. 20 years of patterns didn't change overnight, but they were both committed to creating something healthier than what they'd settled for before. "Mom, I wanted to thank you again." "For what, sweetheart?" "For showing me that I didn't have to accept being treated as secondary. For proving that women can demand respect instead of just hoping for it." That evening, I stood on the balcony of my downtown apartment, watching Austin's skyline light up as the sun set behind the hills. The leather portfolio sat on my coffee table, Harold's letters carefully preserved alongside the business cards that now read, "Lorraine Shepherd, CEO." Harold had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't spent my useful years behind me when Jason called me a burden. I'd spent them preparing for this moment, when being underestimated would become the foundation for proving everyone wrong. At 72, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was exactly who I'd always been, a woman capable of transformation, leadership, and reminding the world that dismissing someone based on age and assumptions was always a mistake. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.